process is incredibly important to me. It's important to me because it's one of the things that made me interested in art in the first place.
In today's podcast, we talk with Phillip Hanson about his work in the current exhibition, Matter and Energy, on display at the Saginaw Art Museum through March 3rd, 2021. Hanson explains the process of building dioramas, photographing them, and then digitally manipulating the photographs. In our discussion, he shares his perspective on the process of creating his art, as well as the intersection of the physical and virtual world. We are here today with Phillip Hanson. Phillip, welcome to the Saginaw Art Museum podcast. Glad you could join us.
Thanks a lot, Thor. I'm glad to be here.
For those who may not have seen your work before, specifically the digital work that we have at the museum right now, how would you describe the digital pieces that you have created?
There are a lot of ways to describe it. The best way, of course, always is to go to the museum yourself and check it out. If you can't make it there, you can go to my website, which is just my name, philliphanson.com. The work is quite varied, really. I would say that the images are not what you would expect to see necessarily. They're abstractions. They are not images of things. They're more or less images of spaces. And I know that's quite vague, so you might have to ask a few more questions to get me
Sure.
get me there.
Well, maybe if you explain the process a little bit about how you create these digital images, that would help.
Right. So process is incredibly important to me. It's important to me because it's one of the things that made me interested in art in the first place. I remember the first painting I ever made, and I'm trained as a painter, so I do paintings as well as these digital works that I actually consider them as paintings. But my first painting experience was actually a non-objective abstract work of art. And I had a clear idea of some blobs, and I painted them. And then when I looked at the result, I was satisfied that I did it the way I wanted to, exactly how I wanted to. And I absolutely hated it. And it wasn't until a few months later that I tried painting again. And this time I didn't have a plan. I just started pushing paint around on a surface, and an interesting image happened. And it was something that was more interesting to me than having a pre-planned idea of what the result was going to be. And it was a surprise. It was kind of like Christmas morning, or just having no expectations and arriving at a solution. And there's something really beautiful about that. To me, it's kind of like faith in a way, in that when I start an image, I don't have any idea of what's going to happen. And sometimes in the process, everything feels miserable and it feels lost. And then eventually, through the process, something comes about that is what I wouldn't really expect. And so for most of the images in the gallery right now, those images are in the same way not planned from the beginning. And they're heavily mediated through process. So I might begin by finding an interesting pattern, some pattern from my life. So, and by that I mean like literally a pattern. So I might open an envelope and see an interesting security pattern on an envelope. And then from there, I will manipulate that pattern digitally to change it, to make it more varied and spatial. And then I'll have a bunch of digital files of just patterns. I take those patterns and I cut them out, usually with a computer, a robotic cutter, like a Cricut, something like that, if the listeners are familiar with that. And I create sculptures out of those cut pieces of paper. And this gets long because it's a very long and mediated process. And then I'll set those sculptures of paper up in different ways. And I will try to create a sensation that's visually appealing to me. And oftentimes that sensation arrives through memory and experiences that I've had elsewhere. So, for example, one of my first jobs as a kid, when I was about 5, my dad had a small apiary, and we would work with bees. And so, one of the things I might do is I might take a beehive smoker, and while I'm photographing these cut paper sculptures, I might add actual smoke into the image, or I might shine a light off of a cheese grater to get a visual effect. I take those photographs, and I take hundreds of those photographs, and that is sort of the raw data that I use to make these images. So that's the beginning part of the process, and there's a secondary part that follows.
So in sort of the building of those layers of photographs, maybe not to make too close of an analogy, but that in a sense is almost your palette or your paint that you're working with. Do you think that would be an accurate description, or would you describe it a different way?
Yeah. So I guess I would describe it I think it's accurate, but I might use different words. And what I mean by that is, when you're going through these processes, there's something akin. I think it's Robert Smithson who I think it's Robert Smithson who's known for a sculpture where he backed up a dump truck full of asphalt and dumped it down a hillside. And there's something about that kind of idea where when you do something like that, you don't know exactly what it's going to do, but over time you get an idea of the subtleties that might occur in action like that. And so, just like with paint, if I were to pour paint over a surface and let it drip in a certain direction, there are certain things like that digitally that you can control, certain filters and other things, both in the photography part, the sculpture part, and the digital manipulation part. They're all almost like filters of consciousness that I tune in to find the image that I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think that's a sort of an interesting way of describing that. It feels like, in this process, there's almost a sense of innocence in the sense of not knowing exactly what's going to happen, but having some concept of how things work together or don't work together because of the experience that you've had before. So you're almost building on that.
Yeah, I would say that's correct. I'd also add that I don't really enjoy it unless I get sort of lost on the journey, unless I'm working on something and I get completely frustrated on it, and then I find some resolution. There's something about getting lost to find something new, or moving into a territory where you don't really know the boundaries, and then discovering something and bringing that back to share with other people. I think that's one of the things that a lot of artists strive to do, to find something, to see something they haven't seen, and to bring it back and to share it with others. I think that's a great gift that artists give the community.
Yeah, and you're almost telling us a story in a sense, when you talk about this frustration that you experience, and then there's still this beginning and middle and end, and that process along the way becomes a story to that final image or that final piece of art. How do you feel like you're able to know when you're done, when a piece is finished, or do you feel like that's a little bit more ambiguous with some pieces that you work on rather than others? Tell me a little bit more about sort of the ending part of the process.
Right. So the interesting thing about working digitally is that there's the potential for no waste whatsoever. and there's the potential for unfinished business to be at peace. And so what I what I mean by that is, um, there are many works that haven't been resolved. So for every one in the exhibition, there might be 30 um, iterations of that, or there might be other versions that didn't arrive at a solution that I thought I wanted to share with others. But the interesting thing about that, and what I mean by no waste, is it's all there on a hard drive, and on a particular day, I might look at those on the day I'm making them. I might think that, oh, these are no good and they're terrible, and I can enjoy that bit of suffering for a moment there, and I just put them away. Well, I can come back to those same images like 3, 4, 8 years later and think, wow, I was really onto something. That's a really good idea. And that's something really beautiful about working in this way. And it happens in the physical studio, but there's not the same kind of flexibility. You can't destroy an image and then do Command Z and have everything go back to normal. So there's something about that. But in terms of the one, like how I know I'm at a place I want to share it with others, there's a lot of factors that that come into play for that. And I think we all, as creative people, I think, not that I can speak for all creative people, um, but uh, I I think there are parameters of or ideas that you want to share, or that you privilege. And for me, one of those ideas is a sense of familiarity, and 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 almost like that feeling of being lost I was talking about. There's moments where I feel like almost like a deja vu sort of sensation, like, this is it. This is the place that I was thinking of but didn't know it, or I've arrived here. And it's just, for me, it's that kind of sensation. There may be aspects of that are classic in terms of um, design, in terms of the way one might balance a composition, or in terms of a color palette that's also classic. There's a lot of, in my work, you'll see a lot of complementary color schemes or analogous color schemes, and um, you know that sort of that may or may not play into the sense of it being finished. And my guess is it probably does. There's a lot of subconscious things going on when you're working in this way.
So, sort of along that sort of line, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the difference between working in a digital space and viewing that digital piece in a digital space versus the physical space. With our phones and computers, we're engaged in art in a different way than people in previous generations. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what your view is of how people are able to consume your pieces, whether that's sort of scrolling along or coming to the museum and standing in front of a work. And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think particularly, that question is an excellent question, particularly considering the situation we're in with the COVID-19 pandemic, because even more so, people are viewing and consuming and interacting with art in a digital way on their phone than they have ever in the past. I would imagine that that's true. I know it is for me. I'm going to the museums less than I normally would right now, and I think that that's probably true for a lot of people. And there's something really nice about being able to share your work on a platform that people can see it so readily and easily. I'll share my work on my website, on Instagram, and other places, and the convenience of it, I think, is tremendous. That being said, there's a disconnect in some ways between normally. Well, if let's take for example a painting in a museum. If if you're seeing one of the paintings there in the Saginaw Art Museum, it's a much different experience to see them in person than it is to see them um, on a small screen. And part of that is the materiality. So for the digital work, that's a question that I'm always thinking about, because really the only way it becomes material is through some kind of printing process. And I have the work in the exhibition mounted in a couple different ways. One is traditional framing with glass over it, and another one is face mounted on um, a surface that's like a plexiglass. It's not. It's a harder surface than that. But both of those expressions have a different sensation, a different feeling to them. The ones that are face mounted, they don't have a border around them, and they feel a little bit more object like than the ones that are within frames. For me and my entire art practice, I think about this question of materiality a lot. I think about how we're kind of going between the virtual world, between the screen. 1 second, and the next second we're doing something in our physical space. And so for my paintings, my handmade painted works, I try very much to express the sort of physicality of the substance of paint and material. That can't be achieved, at least with the processes I'm doing digitally. And so for my work, there's a dialogue between those pieces that are very physical and the ones that are digital. I feel like I'm kind of going all over the place on this answer, Thor.
No, it's a difficult thing to think about. I'm glad that you're addressing it because you are sort of crossing those boundaries both ways.
Yeah. So the other thing I should mention, and it doesn't really apply to the exhibition I have up in the Saginaw Art Museum, but many times it relates to the scale of the piece. And so if there was a digital work that's printed very, very large, the sensation that we get from that is different than a digital work that's printed very small. And when our physical bodies are challenged by the scale of an image, that causes us to think about that image in a different way. It's different than something that you can hold in your hand, right? So that the only problem with that is it's expensive to produce. So if you were to take one of my digital images and produce it at a very large scale, that for me, that's prohibitive.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of the future directions that you would like to go in? Or do you feel like looking towards the future, you're sort of approaching that the same way that you're approaching the creation of these pieces, where there's a sense of discovery about what's going to happen next and trying not to get moving down the road too far, and just enjoying each stage that you're working in?
Well, I wish I could enjoy each stage that I'm working in. Like, there's something about my process that I enjoy it incredibly, and I love doing it. But it's not like it's not enjoyable all with just smiles and happiness. There's a good deal of frustration and feeling like everything's about to implode before there's resolution. And so when I look to the future, the more difficult question for me really is like, how do I limit the possibilities in some way? And I say that because, one of the things I do is I teach at Saginaw Valley State University, and I teach the first classes that students get, the foundation classes. And one of the things that we do in those classes is to limit the criteria for the assignment so that the student has to be creative within that space. It's a way for them to learn very specific things and to get a level of mastery over those concepts. And so one of the most difficult questions for me is, what are the best questions for me to ask? How can I limit my exploration to those questions and those ideas? Because, I wake up in the morning and I may have 10 ideas, but that doesn't that's not always a good thing. That can cause choice paralysis. It can, and that's usually what happens. You have all these ideas and you just end up sitting on them because it takes time to work them out. So for me, moving forward is always about sort of creating or finding limitations that carry with them potential and some kind of power.
Well, Phillip, thank you so much for sharing your insights today and for sharing your art with the community here at the Saginaw Art Museum. I'm looking forward to seeing whatever limits you find and seeing how you work inside those limits.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, and I do appreciate the opportunity to chat about my work. Thanks so much, Thor.
Thank you for listening to the Saginaw Art Museum podcast. You can stay connected with the museum through our website and social media channels. We invite you to become a subscriber of this podcast or become a monthly contributor to the show to help us carry out our mission of providing art for all.